beautiful day today.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're excited you're here.
So if you're wondering where you are today, this is a session from the Summer Blitz that Wayne Risa is offering. And this one is centered around nurturing success with MTSS, unleashing the joy of every student. If you weren't aware, joy has been the theme for our Summer Blitz. And we thought, what a better way to celebrate students' assets and all the wonderful talents they bring to our school and our classrooms. So we thought weaving in MTSS would be a perfect fit for a session today. So we're excited to have some people here live with us. We also know that many people have registered and will watch it at their leisure. But we're glad to have you here today. We will be on for about an hour. We've got, I see a few people in their vehicles and perhaps other people are trying to multitask. We do that well as educators. But our plan is to have you do some reflecting today, perhaps even adding a few things to the chat to keep us a little interactive. And then hopefully you'll take some of the things that we talk about today and reflect upon those, which will actually bring some joy to entering into this coming school year.
So as Colleen mentioned, we do see that some of you are in your cars, and that is absolutely okay. You will get a recording of this session as well as a link to the slide deck. So don't worry if you don't get all of the links for the resources that we're going to share today. They will be sent to you by email probably tomorrow, so you'll have access to them. And also, if you are in a district and you have worked all day because you've been with kids and you still wanted to be here this afternoon, thank you so much for doing that. And thank you so much for doing what you do for kids. You ready to get started, Colleen?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a question in the chat about filling out both forms. Yes, please fill them both out. If you are in need of sketches, you'll need to fill out that second sheet as well. So my name is Colleen Whalen. I'm one of the literacy consultants at Wayne Risa, and I've teamed up with Heather. She's going to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather, and I'm an assessment and instruction consultant at Risa. And I love presenting with Colleen. Colleen and I do a lot of work together around MTSS and helping districts, helping buildings, helping schools, and even helping classroom teachers, because it does span throughout the entire system.
During our time together, we are hoping to go through and review what is MTSS. Sometimes we throw out acronyms and think that people understand what they mean. They even change. Sometimes the acronyms change and meanings might change over time as well. And so we're going to just kind of go through and make sure everyone has an opportunity to think through this common definition of MTSS. We'll dive into how MTSS and supporting the whole child really work together. And as we do that, we'd like to lean into the statewide essential documents, specifically the school-wide documents, the K-5 and the 612, which actually help us to support creating a really solid foundation for creating an MTSS framework. And then lastly, we're going to dig into student identities. Of course, this is why we're all in education, being there to help kiddos, right? And no matter what level you're teaching or what area or role you play in your school, we all know that we can do our part in helping to lift and celebrate all the students bring with them each day to school.
So Colleen and I, when we do this work with districts and with teachers and leaders, we often say that it's the work of our minds, our hands, and our heart. So these are some of our guiding questions that we have for you today. The first being of a mindset, like how might you ensure that students know you value and you trust them? How might you include students' funds of knowledge in your classroom? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then when we think about our hands, the things that we do, our practices, how do you center relationship building throughout the year? Like really thinking about how does relationship building a consistent part of your practice, just like focusing on content instruction. What practices affirm student identities and ways of knowing in your classroom? And what practices allow each student to find success as their fullest self in your classroom. And then this last part is the relationship, right? Like this is the heart work that we talk about when we work with teams. How might you meaningfully include students in decisions about what's best for them? And lastly, what strategies might you use to appropriately give honest feedback to get honest feedback from your students? Because they can tell us a lot, and that can really be helpful in informing our practice and the ways in which we work inside our schools. So take a moment and I know some of you are in the car, but take a moment and think about which one you might want to make an intention around. Something that having to do with your mindset. Is it perhaps a practice, things that we're doing with our hands, or is it a relationship, something with our hearts? We'll give you a moment to think about which one you want to focus on today.
So as we think through those intentions, keep that in mind. Depending on your role and how you're going to support students this year, keep that in mind. Think about, is it a mindset? Is it a practice? Is it a relationship that you'll need to build? And hopefully we come back to that idea throughout this time together. What we'd like for you to do today is just go ahead and place 3 words, a word or a phrase that come to you when you hear the words or the acronym MTSS. And this is something we call a waterfall. You may have gotten used to this activity when we were doing many of our virtual sessions together. But if you could take a moment and just type in, if it's safe for you, certainly, just a couple of words that come to mind when you hear the words MTSS. So we've got a couple of ideas coming in the chat. We're hearing things like building relationships and doing what's best for kids, helping students succeed. Collaboration, you're going to hear that term a lot. You probably already have heard the term collaboration in any of the MTSS work you're doing. Again, success for students and supporting them with interventions and feedback. Actually thinking about MTSS supports in reading, behavioral, and one-on-one. We're hearing things like supports and scaffolds, encouraging, building confidence in kids as they build lending students your confidence as they build their own. That's wonderful. And trust. Thank you, Terrence, for placing that in the chat. Building positive relationships. That's one of the biggest pieces of MTSS because we are working in collaboration with one another. And you'll see and hear us talking about being cogs of a wheel, right? And or a gear in the cogs of a wheel and how all of those pieces are interconnected. Thank you so much for adding your insight around where you're coming from with MTSS.
Sorry, everyone. You would think that I'd know how to operate Zoom. So when we think about MTSS in Michigan, and other states have their own definition of MTSS, but in Michigan, we like to think of it as a framework that is composed of multiple research-based and evidence-based practices, which include interventions, and that it's comprehensive and it's always evolving. We also like to think of it as a collection of practices. So it's not just one initiative that the district will engage in or glom onto, but that it's a collection of things that work cohesively and collaboratively to ensure supporting the whole child. In Michigan, we have five key components that are interdependent and complementary. So we can't just focus on one without focusing on the other 4. So in Michigan, we focus on team-based leadership, a tiered delivery system, the selection and deselection of instruction, implementation, interventions, and supports. This also means that districts and systems have a robust, comprehensive, and balanced assessment system, meaning that we know exactly what we're using our assessments for, and we are data literate around making decisions around those assessments. And that we also engage in continuous database decision making. So all of these pieces, when working cohesively together, make up the umbrella of MTSS. And as Colleen mentioned, there are other pieces that fall underneath that umbrella. Things like PLCs or professional learning or response to intervention. All of those pieces are part, or you can find parts of them within these 5 components. Colleen, did you want to add anything?
Would you please share your analogy of the pinwheel?
Oh, yes. Okay, so the pinwheel, if any of you have children that have ever had a pinwheel and have like taken it apart, you probably know that it's impossible to put it back together and have it function correctly. But what you should notice is that the pinwheel is one continuous strip of material. It's not separate pieces that make up the pinwheel. It's one piece that is folded to create these pins. So it really kind of solidifies that all of these pieces have to work together in order for the system of MTSS to work. That's why it's referred to as a framework and not like a thing that we engage in, but it's a system of things that are working together.
Thanks, Heather. I always love it when you describe that pinwheel, because the icon that we see often in Michigan for MTSS is exactly that. And actually, the next slide will show you a few other symbols that you've probably seen, especially if you're one of the leaders in your building. You're probably very familiar with the MyKIP framework and using that tool to help frame your school improvement goals. You'll also see the whole child icon there, as well as the MTSS icon. And we really wanted to lift the idea that these 3 are working in tandem with each other to help support your school system and to help students. And we like to put the whole child in the center there, because really when we're thinking about all kids and what it is they need, we need to look at all aspects of that child. Sometimes when people think about MTSS, they might just think about academics, but we know wholeheartedly that an MTSS framework that it's functioning well is looking at not only academics, but behaviors and also social emotional learning aspects of that child. And so it's really important that we see these 3 pieces working in tandem with one another. You'll notice these icons here again. And really what we wanted to lift around the MTSS framework is that it is comprehensive. As Heather mentioned, those 5 components are all pieces of this framework, and they are focused on research-based strategies. But what we wanted to highlight today, really lifting that idea of joy, is thinking about individual students and what it is they might need, but also lifting up the assets of that whole child and thinking about the talents that they bring each and every day. Sometimes we might encounter a situation where if there's a barrier or a challenge for us in a classroom, we think of it as a deficit. We might think of it as a bother. And what we want to do is change that mindset and think around what this child is bringing to the surface. How do we go about looking at the positive side of this and helping to lift up what is exactly what we'd like to see to help support them, either academically, behaviorally, or socially?
And this means how we talk about kids and the words that we say matter. And it also matters with our mindset. So when we talk about being of the mind, our heart and our hands, we also have to put these things into practice. So some of the language that often is associated with MTSS or with even data in general can often be deficit based. So for example, words like we hear words like at risk. Well, at risk actually means it's a funding source that lots of schools get if you get 31A money. Or sometimes we hear words like they're a special ed kid. Well, it's just a student receiving special education services, right? So when we think about the language that's used, often when we think of MTSS as being very intervention based and almost like problem solving, we're putting ourselves in a deficit mode. We really want to be proactive and we want to lift and celebrate all of the things that our children do bring to school. So it really means like flipping our language and flipping our mindset around the words in which we use when we're talking about students. We want to be strengths driven. we want to focus on the opportunities that we have when we're working with our young people. And we also want to use words like multilingual student instead of, English learner. So it's just a small switch of language that really makes a big difference, especially because whether or not we think kids are listening, they're always listening. The other piece too is we want to really be mindful of communicating the needs through behavior, right? Like, so if a student is defiant or a behavior problem, they're just communicating in a way that may not be through verbal, right? So it's just the small switch, but something to be really mindful of when you're engaging with within the an MTSS framework.
And so what we'd like to do next is to share with you, I'm going to go ahead and place these in the chat. These are our organizational practices. We have a K-5 document and a 612 document. And these are offered through the General Education Leadership Network. That's a statewide network that really helps to support educators in all aspects of the field. These school-wide and center-wide practices are really important for us to look at when we're working through the systems work in our schools and our districts. And one thing we wanted to lift here are the values piece. Now you're going to see that the K-5 and the 612 practices do differ slightly. There's a lot of common themes among both documents, but what we wanted to lift today are the values piece. So I'm just going to give you a quiet moment to read through those bullets around things that we would like to lean into when we think around the values listed here. So as you're reading through these pieces that are being lifted in these documents, what are some key things that are sticking out to you? You might place them in the chat. You could also unmute and lift a word or a phrase that's resonating with you. We're seeing some of the same words that we saw earlier today when you were just thinking through MTSS and what that means to you. And that's wonderful. These documents actually don't necessarily say multi-tiered systems of support, but they certainly lean into all of them. So we're seeing things like equity coming up and trusting relationships. We see identity and trust and research-based. We see a caring and nurturing environment. Meaningful change is never done. Taking risks. Thank you so much for inputting all of those ideas. Yes, and yes, and yes. Gosh, if we could have a school system, if we could have a district functioning in this way, how wonderful we would all feel at the end of each and every day. It's such challenging work, but we're working together as a team. One of the things I did want to lift is that never ending work, right? Oftentimes we'll say, let's focus on the process and not the product. And yes, there are times when we'll need to have some products and we'll need to have some organization and logistics functioning very smoothly. But for the most part, this work is being done all of the time. It's ongoing, continuous work, and we learn year after year. Heather and I have been at this quite a while, and something's always shifting and we're learning more. And I think that's a good thing. I can't function the way it did 5 years ago. So perhaps you're noticing that collaborative piece again. Perhaps you're looking at the equity portion and making sure options are available to all kids in all aspects of our educational world. You might even be looking at social identities and looking through there. Whatever lens you are looking into it today, the hope is that you're really putting kids at the forefront of this work.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better, Colleen. That was absolutely beautiful. And as we think about all these things, right? Like we say these words and these are things that are really good. And we want these for our schools and for our districts and for our classrooms. We have to recognize that often beliefs are what drives us to do what we do, right? Sometimes it's hard to slow down and pause and really think about what is it that I'm doing, and is it in the benefit of students? Am I lifting up students? Am I honoring voice and choice and identity? And so one of the things that when we engage with districts, we like to talk about this idea of actually, instead of just talking the talk, it's actually walking the walk, right? And so we have to think about really digging deep and challenging some of our own beliefs and mindsets that we have. And that's why mindset is part of our guiding questions today, because often things that we think, maybe we don't necessarily say, but things that we think come out in actions that maybe we don't put together that are connected. So one of the things that we like to, when working with teams, we always like to talk about and kind of interrogate some biases that we have, because we all have them coming into the classroom. Implicit bias is something that we all carry, but it's whether or not we're checking ourselves continuously and reflecting on things that we're doing, things that we're thinking, and how that looks like to our students in the classroom. So one of the things that we like to show is it's Shook's model of how change happens and how beliefs actually work inside of an organization. So Shook was actually one of the first Americans to be a manager at Toyota over in Japan. And he noticed immediately when he came on board that how their culture worked. And so his model of change, as he was entrenched in the organization of Toyota, was that change actually happened to behavior first. And so it was like working through this behavior, like we were actually modeling the change that we want to see. And that's how change actually happened. It wasn't enough to say, we're going to change people's mindsets, because we can talk about that all the time, but it's what we actually do that makes the difference. And so as any part of working with children or working on an MTSS team, it's fruitful to often reflect and interrogate the things that we have, so that we can be more intentional practitioners in the classrooms, that we are being really mindful about lifting up in all those value statements that are in those organizational practices.
That makes me think about a student that I've had, in the past, of course, but really like changing the way that I was thinking through that student. So this was a number of years ago, and well, now we're calling students that come to school with multiple language multilingual. Back in the day, we called them English learners. And I remember being a little concerned about addressing the needs for her because I couldn't speak that language. And I remember thinking, oh my, what am I going to do so that she can be fluent and understand everything in English? And if I could look at it with new eyes, with what I know now, what I would say is, oh my gosh, she has so much to bring to our classroom. Share all that you have about your language and your culture to our classroom. Let's learn from you just as you will learn from us. And so again, just changing that mindset, but I had to change my behaviors and the actions that happened in the classroom so that I could celebrate all of the talents that she did bring, things that we all didn't have, right?
Yeah, so it really gets us to really being reflective practitioners. Like it needs to happen all the time, and there needs to be space for that to happen inside the school day during professional learning, so that we can make those shifts, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really like, we're really asking us to think different about MTSS, right? Everything that you put in the chat is everything that we want for MTSS, right? We want to support kids. So it's a matter of really like framing it as, what if we could create schools and classrooms that were always safe and joyful? Colleen and I are in a lot of classrooms, and there are varying degrees of safety, personal safety, emotional safety, and joy, especially around like what's being taught, maybe the books that are being read, perhaps whether or not the task in front of us is relevant or connected to me as a student or my community or neighborhood. But what if we also can be really mindful and intentional about valuing and lifting up our student identities and their funds of knowledge? That means that we are honoring the things that they bring to school, those shared experiences, those lived experiences that they have at home, their language, their culture. All of those things are of value and they make our schools better places. And what if we can encourage and embrace student choice and voice and autonomy? Like we talk about building self-directed learners, but what does that look like in the classroom? How do we do that? We can do it through voice and choice and allowing students to be selective of what they want to read or how they want to show their learning. And we also want to acknowledge the many ways that difficult situations can be resolved, right? It doesn't always have to end in discipline. It might be talking something out, figuring out maybe the root cause of what's going on with a particular student, but knowing that there might be multiple ways to solve a situation or resolve a situation. We want to be mindful of that. And then lastly, what if we centered equity in all of our decision making? And that includes thinking about how we look at data and thinking about how we prescribe interventions for our kids.
So Heather, as you were mentioning these questions and our way of thinking, it really makes me think about different roles that are represented maybe here online with us or perhaps future listeners. And I think about what we can do. What do we have the control over? Sometimes we feel like we don't have control or we can't influence decisions, but just by looking at some of these questions that you have framed for us, make us think about what we could do with the students that are in front of us, or where I can influence. And Heather and I are mindful of that when we come and visit you and other communities we're typically not a member of. And so we have to think about where we can make the biggest impact, but also influence others to like push on that a little bit. And perhaps it's your voice in a PLC, or perhaps it's a conversation you're having with one of your parents. There's lots of different ways that we can really lift this way of thinking as we continue on. So sometimes it's easy as classroom teachers, maybe special education teachers, perhaps even social workers, to say, I'm not in control of that. I don't have the power to make those decisions. Yes, that could be true, but you do have a voice, right? And we want all of you to be lifting your voice and really honoring those students and speaking for them. So, you may have come across this image that you see on the screen. It's been around for quite a while, and it has been revised and changed a while too. Actually, this is the first time Heather and I are using the image the way it is portrayed. Probably a decade ago, we were using the first two images that you see on the screen towards the left, equality and equity. And now we're starting to see some images where we're looking more towards the right and thinking about how that leads to liberation. And really, even one step further, thinking about how you might weave autonomy or voice and choice into this whole notion. So, just look at the images and kind of think through that. We look at equality. We think everyone's getting the same, and we think we're doing what we need to do. We push towards equity. Oh, not everybody does need the same thing. We're giving people what it is that they need. But then if we think even farther around that way, we're removing barriers. You don't see a fence there. We're removing those barriers that might be facing some of our students. But then lastly, someone brought this up to me just last week. Maybe we don't want to watch a baseball game, right? Perhaps we would like to invest our time in something else. How could we weave in some autonomy with that piece? So I really like these ideas of thinking about the whole child And how are we really lifting up what is it that they need during the school day? Very different from perhaps the way we were all raised. Heather, do you want to add anything on?
No, except that I would be in that other camp of not wanting to watch baseball. So having the choice to maybe watch a different game or do something else, really empowering kids, right? That's empowering.
Certainly not the Tigers yesterday. That was not the game to watch, if any of you were.
So we want to think about how this can work and how we can work differently to really position student identities and ways of knowing as an asset. So we have a little vignette for you, and we'll talk a little bit about the vignette in just a second. But it really, I want you just to listen and kind of look at the picture before I flip to the next slide, and think about the questions that are on the screen. So this is Jolene, and she is obviously wheelchair bound. But what identities, just by looking at her, what identities or assumptions might we make about this student, just from what you see? Just knowing that Jolene is 17 and she is wheelchair bound. And we can use the chat. What might be some assumptions that if you just were to see this student in the hallway, you might think or might creep into our mind? Okay, outgoing, independent, good, joyful.
Yeah, that beautiful smile. She sure seems joyful, doesn't she?
Oh my gosh, she's so cute. What else? Strong, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we know we're in this session, right? But not everybody holds our same values of lifting up kids and celebrating kids, right? So if somebody were to see this student, they might think differently of her, right? They might just see a wheelchair and just think, oh, she's receiving, she's a special ed kid, right? But
Valerie said in the chat, additional resources needed to have a quality education. What was coming to my mind was maybe she couldn't participate in physical education course because maybe the activity we were doing next was playing soccer.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. But people, when you see children just at face value, like negative thoughts could creep in about who they are and what they could do, right? Or what they could contribute. But Jolene, even though she's wheelchair bound because she has cerebral palsy, she was born in the Dominican Republic and she came to the United States to have surgery on her foot. So she is a multilingual learner. She speaks Spanish. She lost her mother to cancer and was in a homeless shelter for about a year or so until she could have stable housing with her grandmother. But she's an honor student and she aspires to become a doctor to study the cancer that took her mother from her. So now that we know a little bit more about this student, how might we celebrate all of these things that make Jolene Jolene? What might we do? She's remarkable, isn't she?
Can you repeat the question again, please?
Yeah, how might knowing a little bit more about her, knowing that she's a multilingual student, she speaks both Spanish and English, that she's an honor student, she wants to be a doctor, oncologist, she wants to study medicine, she's lived in a homeless shelter, she's now with her grandmother. How might all these things, how might we celebrate these pieces of her beyond what we actually can see in the picture?
So Octavia said to invite her to speak to other kids about resilience. And she might not even know what resilience is, but she is certainly a face for resilience, just hearing her story.
Oh my gosh, that's beautiful. Yeah, an assembly for sure. There's lots that you could do to lift her, to honor and lift what she's bringing to school up.
Octavia, you unmuted. Would you like to share? Oh, unmute again.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
My phone is not catching up. I kept hitting the button like, is it working? I was going to apologize because I'm on my phone and I swipe instead of typing and I send it. I'm like, oh, I said ornery. That's not the word I was trying to say.
Oh, I knew exactly
There
what
was
you
no
meant.
squiggly line. I was like, oh my goodness, great way to put something out there. So yes, other. I'm glad you read that part and not ornery.
Thank you for sharing your ideas. That was perfect. Just to lift her stories about how she's been able to persevere and show resilience. Assembly time, which would be so much fun. That sounds like a celebration to me. And then Carrie also mentioned setting up opportunities for her to shadow, perhaps maybe some medical professionals or volunteer somewhere. So what an excellent way to lift up some of the talents that she's bringing forth.
These are beautiful suggestions and simple ones, right? I'm sure you could find a medical professional that would be willing to have any young person interested in the profession shadow or just learn more about, or even just, bringing in other languages into an assembly and really lifting up other kids' voices. These are beautiful. And really, like, if we're thinking about how much things cost, like, these are cost effective, right? Free.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to read more about her story, this is actually a true story. She's lovely, and I did link the article in the slide deck. So when you receive that, you can actually read all about her. She's really a beautiful student.
So Heather, as you're talking, even though Heather and I spent a number of hours planning for today's session, I'm really reflecting on myself as an educator, and I'm going back a few years because it's been a little while since I've been in the classroom. And I wonder to the folks here and the folks listening is, are you right now reflecting upon your new school year and who you're going to meet this year? We can't go back in time, but we can go forward, and we can go forward in a positive way. And as I was reflecting, just even Heather, as she was describing all of the good qualities and the positivity that Jolie was representing, made me think about how much I had to look at my inner self as an educator to say, oh, I have to really honor this. I have to be okay with it. I have to be accepting of all students. And sometimes that puts us in a scary spot because we don't know a lot about it. I don't know a lot about cerebral palsy. That might put me in a scary position because I need to learn more. And so it's raising that hat to vulnerability in our classrooms in front of kids. I think that really will help to support building that community. So when we talk about identity, and we think about Jolie Lee and all of the wonderful things she has brought to her school and her classrooms, we think about other things that we might want to lift and celebrate with students. And so you can see all of these different ways that we can lift people's identity and really celebrate them. So thinking about languages that people bring to the classroom and how we could center our learning around dissecting other languages. Perhaps it's family and community. Maybe people are part of an organization, or they're a member to something that you or others might not be aware of. How can we honor that and bring those ideas to the community of learners in our classroom? Perhaps we talk about life experiences and honor those that might be small and local versus global and perhaps maybe a little more exciting, but honoring all those life experiences that come to us and celebrating how people are able to really cherish and celebrate these experiences. What else, Heather?
The thing that I might add, and these are things that we often can think about with children, depending on the level that of students that you're working with, you might even just add like identity, like we do have gender, but you could add sexual orientation, because sometimes at the secondary levels, they have an idea. And that makes up maybe who they are and how they are, working within the classroom or within their communities. The other thing to acknowledge here is that identities can change, right? Sometimes we take on new identities and sometimes we leave identities, right? Like, and I was just really mindful of how true this is last week when we were in a session and we had to talk about maybe a role that we've taken on. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, I've taken on student, like I've gone back to school. And that was just a new identity, as a learner, like that's part of my identity, right this moment, even though we're always learning. But just being mindful that identities can shift and change. And so when we talk to kids about their identity, we often do it at the beginning of the year as kind of a get to know you activity, but being mindful that these can be revisited throughout the year because things may shift, things may change, and value and identities can always be added onto, right? They're really complex. They're not one-dimensional, they're multidimensional. So one way in which, and this is kind of a cool activity to do, and you can make it work for whatever level that you are working with, is to engage students in an identity web. And so it's really simple. You give kids blank pieces of paper and markers or crayons or colored pencils or whatever, however they might want to engage in it. And you just ask them, like, what are some things that make up your identity? And you can sketch it out. You can use words, you can use phrases, you can use pictures, and just have them map it out. Sometimes I put my name in the middle when I've done this with students and teachers. I'll put Heather in the middle, and then I'll put all the things that, make up my identity, that I feel ready to share with that group. But also know that, again, our identities aren't static, and we might need to be mindful that kids might not just be willing to share all their identities with you on the first day of school, right? And so revisiting this once we've built some relationships can maybe reveal some other identities that students hold and might provide you with some more information of things that you can do within the classroom to really lift up and honor the things that they know and their ways of being. So this is one activity that you can do. It's kind of a fun one. And I actually, when I've done this with students, I don't display them because some students might not be okay with you just openly displaying their identity, but you can allow them to put it maybe in a folder, or if you have like a filing cabinet or like a milk crate that you have hanging files on, you can put it in there, and then you can revisit it throughout the year. If you teach a writing course, this could be a way in which to engage kids in some writing, if they just to get things kind of warmed up. But this is just one way to do it. If you were doing this maybe with like little ones, kinders, you might ask them to draw pictures and then have them talk about it. So there's lots of ways that this identity web can be modified depending on the kids that you're working with.
It's making me think of perhaps some students that might begin an identity web, and we're seeing some things that might cause us to be concerned, perhaps, or maybe even it's perhaps like a reach for some support or help in a certain area. And I think this is really an important piece. And of course, by doing these kinds of things, this is what's helping to build those relationships and building that trust. But this can also be another avenue for kids to communicate what it is they might not need, and they didn't even know it. And you might maybe really unfold some of that with students. And if it gets to a situation, there was an opportunity when I was supporting a school, when it got to a situation where I felt like I needed to go and share, with one of my colleagues. It happened to be the social worker in the building, because it was beyond where I felt I needed to go as that literacy consultant. And so I think this is a really powerful way to lift all of students' identities in a positive way, but also knowing our kids are coming to us from a variety of experiences, and we want to really honor them and not quiet them, but to share And so this might come up if you do something like an identity web. You might have a situation where you will reach out with colleagues. So this is another a few other opportunities in ways that you might really lift students' identities and their experiences they bring. So Identity Web was certainly one really nice way that you could start your school year off getting to know kids. And again, as Heather mentioned, going back to revisit, but these are some other ways that we brainstormed that we thought we would share with you. So certainly listening to and trusting your students is probably the biggest one, right? That helps us to build that community of learners. It helps students build those relationships and trust one another. So hearing stories about what's happening at home and hearing about people's families, we then begin to get to be a family within our classrooms. Another one is storytelling through personal narratives. So of course, I'm a literacy consultant, so I lean heavily into this area of sharing your story, but we all have stories to share. So even if it happens to be a science or a math class, we are still sharing our stories. Perhaps I talk about making blueberry muffins in my kitchen and using a recipe. I could do that during our math class, but I'm still sharing a story about what happened at home outside of the school day. But getting to know each other deeply and well. Identity text to write and diverse text to read are really a wonderful way of bringing in different cultures and different ethnicities to our classroom. If we don't have them represented by our students, there are certainly ways we can learn about them in other cultures and cities and towns. Heather, how about the bottom 5?
Yeah, so this is where really connecting with your community is going to be really key. So if you don't live in the community where you're teaching, doing some research around the history of the community or the history of the school, that can really provide some insight as to the hows and whys and ways that things happen inside of the school. But also it's important to empower kids to do their own research too around the history and historicize some of the things and connect it to your curriculum. So you can easily connect doing that research and doing some writing to the literacy standards and even social studies standards as well. But when kids have a deep connection as to the history of their community and connecting that to your curriculum, kids are more interested and they're more invested in the learning. Also, inviting families and caregivers and the community partners into the school. We always say families, but we also know that like our Jolene, like she was homeless for a while and she didn't have a family, so to say, a traditional family is the way in which we think about it. But we can also provide caregivers. So kids that may be in foster care or maybe living in a homeless shelter, they are in care of somebody else. So we want to invite them into the building as well. If you have access to like a parent liaison or a community liaison that you can leverage, do so, because they can get the word out into the community that to support and connect with the school. It's really powerful, and some of the most like the best like community engagement nights happen because they have a person that's really in touch. But if you don't, you can also get in touch with your community in which the district that you're working in, just by walking around the district. Like take a walk, notice if they're the churches or the community centers or the neighborhood centers that are there. Notice the stores, like all of those things comprise your community, and work in ways in which that you can leverage them so that they do feel connected to the school. Invite students to share a little bit about the history of their name. Names are really important, and our parents go through a lot to like come up with a name, and there's often a story behind it. Sometimes it has a meaning, but if you get kids to talk about their name and how they got it, what it means, that's just another way. And it's small, but it's just another way. and it allows names to be in the forefront. So when I was working in a school district, one of my very first schools, I had a large, my classroom was, I would say 90% multilingual. It was a beautiful classroom, but students often wanted to go by American names. And they would always tell me their American name because they felt like I couldn't pronounce their given names. So I actively worked to pronounce their given names, and they felt so connected because somebody was actually making the effort. So that's just another way. Invite students to create neighborhood maps, and little ones can do this too. Like, where do you live? Tell me about where you live. What's it like? Where are the places that you go? Are there playgrounds that you go to? Are there maybe there's a clinic you go to, or the library? There's lots of places that kids go when they're not in school. So how do we connect that to what we are doing in class? And then last one, probably one of my favorites, and it gets at the history of wherever you're teaching, is to engage kids in place-based learning. This is a little bit different than project-based, but this means that we are actually considering the place where we are at and what it means, its place in history, and how that can connect to our current content. And Wayne County is rich with opportunities for place-based learning. We have lots of nature trails. We have the river, the Detroit River. We have Belle Isle. There's so many different places. We have Hamtramck, that we can really engage kids in authentic learning opportunities that connect to our content standards.
Heather, thanks so much for sharing all of those ideas. There are a few links that have been placed in the chat. One of them was around the stories about reading and writing and lifting different identities. And the second link is the one about investing in time and celebrating powers of names. And so hopefully you'll see some additional resources within those links. Also, we wanted to leave you today with some other resources to explore. All of these are hyperlinked, but they will give you a little bit more information to dive in to really lifting up students' identity, celebrating, harnessing the joy in your classroom. And so if you're feeling like you'd like to explore a little bit more, or perhaps let's say maybe the mid of November rolls around and you're feeling like you really need your Thanksgiving fall break, you might lean into one of these articles to give you a little refresher until you get to that Thanksgiving break. But please reach out to us if you have further questions around these resources. We're happy to expound on those at any other time. And as we wrap up today, we want to go back to what we talked about at the very beginning when thinking and setting an intention. When we were thinking about maybe perhaps our mindsets, or perhaps our practices, or perhaps our, what was the last one, Heather?
Our hearts.
Our hearts, that's right. How could I forget that one? What might be some actions that you take to nurture that success for all of your students as you enter into this beautiful 23-24 school year? Think back to those practices, those relationships, the mindset, and what actions will you take away with you right now and enter into your school year? Heather, I think we've done it. We have been consistent with our timing. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thanks for being with us. And please keep an eye on our website at Wayne Risa for any follow-ups with some MTSS work. We're actually going to be offering a series, and it will come at you with several different options for learning. So if you're coming from a leadership team perspective, a literacy interventionist perspective, a high school social worker perspective, we're hopefully going to meet the needs that you come with. So please keep an eye out for that in our offerings registration link.
And if we don't have something in our offerings that fully is what you want or what you're thinking about, and you'd like some customized or personalized support, you can always reach out to myself or Colleen. We're happy to set that up. And we have a whole team at RISA. We have an internal MTSS team that mirrors very much what a district team would have. And we have people that are in all of our departments because we want to make sure that we're able to support teams with where they're at and what they need.
Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful evening.